Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 5th of October. And as I was indicating, I wanted to give an extension on the second journal, Edgar Allan Poe, because I spent last class talking about writing papers. Now, this upcoming Monday, when we would normally meet, we are not meeting because that is Native Indigenous Day. That is Monday the 10th, which means that we would next be meeting on Wednesday the 22nd, and you can take up until Wednesday the 22nd to hand in your Poe journal. And I was indicating that because Poe is about short stories, you can elect to do this journal in a number of ways. You can decide to talk about each short story briefly, or you could decide to focus on one short story in depth, or take a kind of mid-level approach and talk about two or maybe even three out of the four short stories that I had assigned. The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Hat. And I thought that these four would give us a good sense of the kind of writing that Edgar Allan Poe does, particularly within the element of the Gothic. I remember taking a Poe seminar when I was in graduate school, and the way the professor characterized Poe was as a drunkard, a drug addict who died penniless and alone in the gutter. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Definitely, we do know that he married his young cousin. We do know that he had this almost abnormal fascination with his mother. We do know that he was adopted and orphaned as a baby. We do know that he had a fear of being buried alive, and we oftentimes see that in many of the texts. There's even been a theory that perhaps he died of rabies. But as we know, that at least according to Lovecraft, we owe to Poe the modern horror story in its final and perfected state. And that Poe, again from Lovecraft's perspective, is a vivid and detached chronicler that reports events as they are, with mood being all important and maintaining a single impression and a standard of realism. And one of the things that I like about Poe is that he can be read symbolically, and he can also be read as the descent into madness, but he can also be read from a supernatural perspective if we so wanted to. And the Fall of the House of Usher is probably the most challenging of the four short stories that I had assigned. It's certainly the longest of the four short stories that I had assigned. And that the house is also supposed to represent the family, just like the family represents the house, the family lineage, so to speak, of Usher. So when we find out about the fall of the House of Usher, when we say house of, we're talking family of, as well as literally the structure that houses the family. And notice the very beginning, the setting, it's referenced as autumn. And one of the things about Poe is that he's a very poetic writer, so very much in the first line. During the whole of a dark, dull, and soundless day, notice all those D sounds. Of course, in autumn, so autumn is supposed to represent descent. And we're told about how the narrator is alone on horseback. And we know already with just the few readings that we've done in the Gothic that isolation is a negative thing in the Gothic tradition. And we learn a little bit about the narrator's relationship with Usher, that they had once been friends, but they've fallen out of touch, and now he's returning back to Usher. And one wonders why it is that Usher would have called on the narrator, Roderick Usher, and the way that he is described as someone who has quite a few challenges. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me as his best and indeed his only personal friend. Again, even though they hadn't seen each other for years. With a view of attempting, by the cheerfulness of my society, some alleviation of his malady. It was the manner in which all of this and much more was said. It was the apparent heart that went into his request, which allowed me no room for hesitation, and I accordingly obeyed forthwith, with what I still considered a very singular summons. Notice that before this, the house is described in a very personified way. We're told that it has eye-like windows. Keep this in mind when we talk about The Haunting of Hill House. Poe also likes to talk about eyes. We'll see that as a common motif, the idea of being able to see the truth. And when we learn about the family itself, that the stem of the Usher race, all time honored as it was, had put forth at no period any enduring branch. In other words, the entire family lay in the direct line of descent and had always, with very trifling and very temporary variations, so lain. It was this deficiency I considered, while running over in thought the perfect keeping of the character of the premises with the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influences which the one, in the long lapse of centuries, might have exercised upon the other. It was this deficiency, perhaps, of collateral issue, and the consequent undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with the name, which had at length so identified the two as to merge the original title of the estate in the quaint and equivocal appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include in the minds of the peasantry who used it both the family and the family mansion, which was a long way of saying what I started with, that basically the house represents the family represents the house. He's also setting up the idea of ancestral relationships, definitely amongst the wealthy, of inbreeding, and it's something that Lovecraft will also criticize when we get to Lovecraft. And some of the superstitions associated with the family, and how his imagination was so important in terms of the way that he received Usher and the environment that Usher lived in. I had worked so upon my imagination as really to believe that about the whole mansion and domain there hung an atmosphere peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity, an atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which had reeked up from the decayed trees and the gray wall, the silent tarn, a pestilent, mystic vapor, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden-hued. And of course, the horrors of the mind might perhaps be much worse than any kind of literal horror. We suggested this with the idea of Frankenstein and the unreliable narrator, and could this all be a figment of Walton's imagination? Or could Walton be accurately portraying what's told to him, but this is all a figment of Victor's imagination? But in this particular piece, we're told about the idea of one's imagination bringing forth horrors. And of course, as we continue on, we get the Gothic atmosphere that we would expect at this point. The angles of the chamber, the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceiling with dark draperies hung upon the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered, with many books and musical instruments laying scattered about, but failing to give any vitality to the scene. I felt I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow, an air of stern, deep, irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. And the description of Roderick is no better. He had a cadaverousness of complexion, an eye large, liquid, luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a surprisingly beautiful curve, a nose of delicate Hebrew model, but with a breadth of nostril unusual in similar formations, a finely molded chin, speaking in its want of prominence of a want of moral energy, hair of a more than web-like softness and tenuity. These features, with an inordinate expansion above the regions of the temple, made up altogether a countenance not to be easily forgotten. And now in the mere exaggeration of the prevailing character of these features, and of the expression they were wont to convey, lay so much of the change that I doubted to whom I spoke. The now ghastly pallor of the skin, the now miraculous luster of the eye, above all startled and even awed me. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, and as, in its wild gossamer texture, it floated rather than fell about the face. And I could say that I can't help but think of some of the descriptions of Victor Frankenstein's creature here. And then we find out about Roderick's malady. It was a constitutional and family evil, another hint of incest, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy, a mere nervous affliction, he immediately added, which would undoubtedly soon pass. It displayed itself in a host of unnatural sensations, morbid acuteness of the senses, He could only wear garments of certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured even by a faint light, and so forth and so on. And then we learn a little bit more about the Roderick family, that he's had a sole companion, his beloved sister, his sole companion for long years. Again, all of these hints suggesting that as they've lived in isolation, they've engaged in an incestuous relationship. And as Stephen King talked about, these texts are oftentimes moral tales, and there is this sense of retribution by the end and justice. And that what Roderick says, that his sister was his last and only relative on earth. Her decease, he said with a bitterness which I can never forget, would leave him the hopeless and the frail, the last of the ancient race of the Ushers. This Madeline, which of course, as we continue on, one of the things that Poe is very good at is talking about psychology. So the use of the word hypochondriac in terms of Roderick from our narrator. And then even a poem embedded within the story. And Poe is known for his poetry, The Raven, for instance, entitled The Haunted Palace. And it very much is indicative of what's happening in the House of Usher, especially the last two stanzas or sections of the poem. Section 5 reads, "But evil things in robes of sorrow assail the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his house the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed." And then the final stanza, stanza 6. "And travelers now within that valley through the red linten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while, like a rapid ghastly river, through the pale door, a hideous throng rush out forever and laugh, but smile no more." And this idea about the sentience of all vegetable things, that basically inanimate objects could have animation within them and could have a certain sense of agency within them, is part of what leads to the eeriness and the possible supernatural elements of this particular tale, that there is consciousness to the inanimate. And we learn a little bit more about the house itself, establishing more mood, that the stones and the fungi which overspread them and the decayed trees which stood around them basically led to this feeling of eeriness. And what we find is that there are numerous vaults, which would not have been unusual for the wealthy, in order to bury family members. And what the narrator talks about is that one evening, Roderick informed me abruptly that Lady Madeline was no more. He stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight, previously to its final interment, in one of the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. And the worldly reason, however, assigned for the singular proceeding was one that I did not feel at liberty to dispute. The brother had been led to his resolution, so he told me, by consideration of the unusual character of the malady of the deceased, of certain obtrusive and eager inquiries on the part of medical men, and of the remote and exposed situation of the burial ground and the family. And then we learned that Roderick and his sister had been twins. Again, the suggestion of duality, which is something that we oftentimes see in the Gothic. But also, as I've suggested before, that this is really a story about the fall of a family because of their ancestral relationship, that there are no longer any possibilities for mating because there really are no other suitable family members to mate with, which is something that would have been very common in royal families, particularly in England. So all of this comes to a head where it seems that Madeline is not dead after all, that she is instead has been buried alive. And again, we don't necessarily know how such a thing could have happened. But this deceased and diseased twin sister, the doppelganger, buried in the family vault, ultimately comes back to life for one would think, a sense of retribution. Now, at the time period of this text, it was not unusual to actually have a fear of being buried alive because it was actually a possibility. So much so that sometimes corpses were buried with strings that were attached to their toes that would run up above ground. And above ground, that string would be attached to a bell. So in the event that someone had been buried alive, keep in mind that medical technology was not as advanced as our own. The corpse reanimating, or at least the idea of it, obviously it wouldn't have been dead in the first place. It just would have been mistakenly classified as dead. Could pull on the string, ring the bell, and then somebody could hopefully dig up the individual. Keep this in mind as well when we get to Dracula, because I think that's led to some of the folklore associated with vampires and resurrection. But it was a real possibility. But whether it was that Madeline was buried alive before she was dead, or she literally was dead and she came back to life, we do know that her ghost, so to speak, her presence will come back to haunt Roderick. The past will always come back to the present and destroy it, particularly when there has been past sin involved. And that's what we get in this particular piece. And of course, the narrator is horrified, and what he sees is the house literally beginning to tear itself apart. And that's very, I think, significant symbolically, because what we see is the loss of the house of the family of Usher. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and dark torrent at my feet closed suddenly and silently over the fragments of the fall of the house of Usher. This is after the narrator has run from the house aghast when Madeline has come to basically confront Roderick. There was blood upon her white robes and the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold. Then, with a low, moaning cry, fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and in her violent and now final death agonies, bore him to the floor a corpse, and a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. So I had suggested that Lovecraft himself talks about the issue of incest, so that's something that you can keep in mind when we get to Lovecraft. The next story that I had assigned from Poe, which also helps to establish many of the themes associated with Gothic, is The Mask of Red Death. And it strikes me, not that necessarily it was written with an understanding of where we would be in the 2020s, but the sense of disease and plague and what that does to community is something that we ourselves have been experiencing. Now, this Red Death, rather than the Black Death, which would be the bubonic plague, the suggestion is red is blood. Blood represents life in Christianity. And that's something also we'll talk about in Dracula when we get to that particular place. And we're introduced to Prince Prospero, who, yes, is indeed prosperous. And he's very happy, he's dauntless, and he's also quite proud. And what he's trying to do in his arrogance, in his hubris, is basically to avoid death. And of course, there will be consequences for this. He isolates himself in deep seclusion with quite a few of the affluent members of his community, thinking that they can outwit the Red Death. And they have a masquerade ball where they're hiding from reality. And of course, we get all of this wonderful Gothic architecture atmosphere. We learn at the beginning the Red Death had long devastated the country, and that Prince Prospero was there in his 5th or 6th month of seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence, and that in that in that locale, there are 7 suites. 7 is oftentimes a symbolic number if you want to think about the 7 deadly sins. And I would argue that those 7 rooms or 7 apartments can represent each of the deadly sins. Notice that all of the rooms as well are given colors. Pride, which would be a deadly sin, could be seen as violet. Envy could be seen as green, if you know about jealousy and that green-eyed monster. Gluttony, perhaps, could be seen as orange. Lust could be seen as purple or a deep blue. Greed could be seen as a white or a yellow. Wrath could be seen as a red. Sloth could be seen as a light blue. But even if we don't necessarily want to connect the colors to the 7 deadly sins, I think what we do see is the impossibility of wealth to be able to protect an individual from the natural course of life. And I do think that in terms of the sins, definitely there's pride. Prospero is so arrogant, he believes he can escape the plague. And he basically mocks death by throwing a party. There will be consequences to that. Envy, think about how envious those individuals are of the people who have not succumbed to the plague and they want to remain part of that group. The greed, the partying that they engage in the midst of that plague. Gluttony, lust, and sloth, I think all of that represents the activities of the partygoers. So we can see, I think, that what Poe is trying to do is to make a statement. And in all of his pieces, he really is trying to make a statement. There is also a reference to a clock, which represents time, something that you can never defeat. It's a gigantic clock of ebony, because time is ultimately the enemy in this particular piece. And at midnight, of course, very appropriate for the Gothic tradition, when the clock strikes is when the whole company comes to a halt. And this is when this masked figure, you might say that this could be the personification of death, comes and invades their masquerade ball. If you know anything about Stephen King and you know something about The Shining, then you might know a little bit about the way it parallels this particular text, because Stephen King was very much inspired by this text. In fact, if you wanted to think about the idea of unmasking, that's something that actually is a direct quote in the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. In addition to 7 being perhaps the 7 deadly sins, there also are the 7 stages of life. Infant, child, teen, young adult, retirement, and then finally elderly. So we could see this too, as well as the passage of the life cycle. And midnight is always an ending, but it's also a beginning as well. The personification of the darkness, the decay, notice the alliteration with the D sounds again, dominion as well. And the ambiguous ending as to whether or not this masked figure literally is a supernatural entity, or is it just a symbol of the death, the Red Death, basically coming to claim its victims, because no one can escape. And then we move to the Telltale Heart. And the Telltale Heart is oftentimes one of the stories that is done at the high school level or even junior high school level. Poe tends to be a favorite of junior high school and high school teachers. I think in part because there's enough of the macabre there to interest students, so they get the sense that they're engaged in something that's somewhat forbidden. But the stories are short and they're not too graphic. So that said, probably you've had some experience with Edgar Allan Poe. I know my first experience with Edgar Allan Poe was actually in junior high school. But The Telltale Heart is a favorite one, I think, in part because it shows not too much gory detail, and it doesn't have the level of complexity that we saw with The Fall of the House of Usher. And I don't know how appropriate the theme of incest might be for that grade level either. And it also doesn't show perhaps the level of complexity that we saw with the previous piece that I had discussed. So The Telltale Heart begins with true, nervous, Very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But what will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I tell you my story. This I narrator makes perhaps for an easier read. We had talked about the complications in Frankenstein where it sounds like we have an I narrator, but we really don't have the I narrator because Walton is taking over the I that Victor would have used for himself and also taking over the I for the other characters that Victor would have been talking about. Even in something like The Mask of the Red Death, we don't necessarily have that use of I that brings us connected to the narrator, which again is, I think, one of the reasons why this particular story, and perhaps also The Black Cat, are so popular in the junior high school and high school level, because of the ability to connect perhaps to the narrator. And notice how we're told he's haunted and that he loved the old man, but he also is obsessed with the old man because of his eye. Notice again that reference to eyes. Eyes oftentimes can see. They're thought to be the windows of the soul. And if we do indeed have a mad narrator, and it sounds like we might, actually we do, then ultimately it makes sense that the narrator would feel rather exposed with someone who is able to see, someone like the old man. And the narrator goes on, you should have seen how wisely I proceeded. I was never kinder to the old man. And then after midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it oh so gently. And it took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening. Ha, would a madman have been as wise as this? And that he did this for 7 nights, again, use of the word 7 or the symbol of 7. And it wasn't the man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And there is in folklore this idea of an evil eye, that a thought and a look can be capable of inflicting injury upon someone. He makes references to things like vultures, things like birds of prey. That's the kind of feeling that he has about the old man. And what he does is ultimately commit murder, and then tries to justify his murder by saying not only was he not insane when he murdered him, but he was so clever at hiding the body that this is just merely an indication of his sanity. And that's, of course, for us as reader, an indication of his insanity. Many a night, just as midnight, when all the world slept, the sound had welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, though I chuckled at heart. I knew he'd been lying awake ever since the first noise when he turned in bed. His fears had ever since been growing upon him, because death was approaching him. Death is capitalized, so in other words, that gives it a sense of personification by capitalizing it the way you would a name. Personification, giving human qualities to inanimate objects. And then, of course, what he talks about is that after he has killed this old man, the precautions I took for concealing his body included dismembering the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. And as graphic as that is, ultimately, it could be much more graphic. So again, it's a text that I think could be more appropriate for a younger audience. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood whatsoever. I'd been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. Ha ha. And at the ending of these labors, it's 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. The bell sounded the hour. They came a-knocking at the street door. I went to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. suspicion of foul play had been involved. And I responded, the shriek was my own in a dream. The old man was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I'd led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasure, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room, desired them here to rest. My manner had convinced them. But again, what he continues to hear, whether it's a supernatural event or it just is his guilty conscience, a ringing that became more distinct, a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly. I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose all over and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder. And then finally, they heard, they suspected, they knew. Were they making a mockery of my horror? Villains, I shrieked, assemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Hear, hear. It is the beating of his hideous heart. And of course, it's his hubris and thinking that he's gotten away with the crime that leads to his being exposed. In fact, this is oftentimes criteria that is an element of criminals, that they oftentimes want to brag about their deeds, and that's what leads to their being exposed. But again, whether this is a supernatural event where the old man's heart literally is making a noise to alert authorities, or it's just psychological and the guilt that this narrator feels, or might I suggest perhaps both at the same time. It needn't be one or the other. And that, I think, is what makes Poe's works so interesting. Of course, he had talked about when he was going to murder the old man, that a new anxiety seized me, that the sound would be heard by a neighbor. So with a loud yell, I threw open the lantern, leaped into the room, and I dragged the old man to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done, but for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. So, of course, eventually he dies, but we wonder if that heartbeat is something that's haunting our narrator, literally, figuratively, or perhaps the two. And finally, we end with the Black Cat. And the Black Cat, if you've read the Black Cat, which I hope you have by this point, is very similar to the Telltale Heart. We once again have an I narrator who's confessing to an evil deed. The Black Cat comes with lots of superstitious associations with it. A superstitious evil. If a black cat crosses your path, it's supposed to be negative. Think that in Egypt, the cat was oftentimes viewed as something that was sacred. Now, our I narrator might be a bit different than our previous I narrator, because this narrator is an alcoholic. So now we're talking about the demon alcoholism rather than the demon insanity. For the most wild yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad am I not, and surely I do not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. So basically, this is his confession before he's executed on the scaffold. Then I think is somewhat important, considering that we will have a similar incident within the story itself. And if you think about it, we've got the narrator who invites us into this mystery, stating a problem. And then another mad protagonist who tells us how he came to his destruction, blaming alcohol, which, yes, in some ways it is responsible. But in the end, the narrator is responsible for consuming the alcohol. And a chain of events are offered, but there's no explanation from Poe or the narrator. We do know that the narrator feels no kind of real remorse. And we do wonder why the character confesses to the crime, though we aren't told about that. But this meaningless violence that Poe oftentimes examines in his short stories, whether we saw it in The Telltale Heart or in The Black Cat, I think is illustrative of the meaningless violence that oftentimes exists within our own society. And for both of these narrators, in The Telltale Heart and The Black Cat, they both seem sane and mad at the same time. But as we continue on with The Black Cat, his confession before his execution in the gallows, he talks about intemperance, or in other words, alcoholism, being an evil because of the loss of reason and the meaningless violence and self-destruction that occurs because of it. And he also talks about his cat named Pluto. Pluto is a significant name. It's the Roman god of the underworld and the lord of death. That said, when he talks about alcohol, he capitalizes it, personifying it as if it really was an enemy. And we also have reference to eyes because he's haunted by Pluto's eye. And of course, this is something that I've suggested with the previous story, that the eye has the ability to see the truth. This story, The Black Cat, is perhaps the story that disturbs most readers the most because of the violence against animals. And I can say that I oftentimes respond this way too, where I can watch a movie and not necessarily have a response to violence against humans, understanding that they're actors, but it's a little bit more difficult for me to make that connection with animals who are also actors. Of course, you know, the old cliche, the horror movie, just don't kill the dog or the cat. Kill anybody you want, but not the dog or the cat. But at any rate, my reason returned in the morning. This was after he basically removes the cat's eye because of an alcoholic episode. I took from my waistcoat pocket, a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of his eyes from his sockets. I blush, I burn, I shudder while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned in the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night, I experienced half horror, half remorse for the crime of which I had been familiar. Keep in mind, too, that the cat is oftentimes seen as a witch's familiar. So this would be the witch's companion with her spells. And all of those images associated with cat, Poe would have been aware of by making this a cat, Black Cat. And at one point, he talks about perverseness, and it's capitalized, and that this is indeed what alcohol can do. It can bring out the perverse. And this is what insanity can do as well. It can bring out the perverse. He then talks about the appeal of the forbidden, and that committing a vile action purely because you know you should not. It's something that I think that Stephen King talked about Gothic and how we might want to participate in the forbidden. The line reads, "Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or a silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not?" And then we see basically his self-destructive nature, which is also an element of what alcohol does throughout the text. There is ultimately, one morning in cold blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree, hung it with tears streaming from my eyes, with the bitterness of remorse in my heart, hung it because I knew that it loved me and because it had given me no reason of offense, and hung it because I knew that in doing so, I was committing a sin. A deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul, and to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. And then he's roused by the cry of fire from sleep. And what he realizes is that ultimately the home is in ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. And perhaps even more strange, that as if graven on the bas relief upon the white surface of one of the walls was the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous, and there was a rope about the animal's neck. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by someone of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from my sleep. The falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the frame flames and the ammonia of the carcass had accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Or at least this is his rationalization. Again, we don't know whether this is a supernatural event or not. And now, what ends up happening is that our narrator gets a second cat, and resembles him in every way except for a splotch of white covering nearly the whole region of the breast. What he continues discussing is how he's haunted by this second cat, who just so happens to be eyeless. Again, whether this cat truly exists or whether this is a figment of the narrator's imagination and guilt. But we know that he's so overcome with the image of this cat and trying to attack it, he ends up attacking his wife instead and ends up axing her to death. Again, you can see parallels with something like the Telltale Heart. And at this point, what he realizes he has to do is to hide the body. So one day my wife accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the old building, which our poverty compelled us now to inhabit after the fire. The cat followed me down the steep stairs and, nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a groan. And again, as graphic as this is, it could be much more graphic. So he does everything he can to hide his wife and her body. And ultimately, we see that there are a few inquiries, and then eventually a party of police come, very similar to the Telltale Heart. And he says how his heart beat calmly. I think that's a nice little nod to the Telltale Heart. Of one who, as if one slumbers in innocence. Gentlemen, I said to them as the party ascended the steps, I delight to have allayed your suspicions. By the by, gentlemen, this was a very well-constructed house. These walls, are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together, and here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which I held in my hand upon the very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. And then there's a voice from within the tomb, a continuous scream, and as the wall is torn down by the police, the corpse, already greatly decayed, fell to the floor, and upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. And of course, Pluto had also been hung, so it seems to be an appropriate punishment for our narrator. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. Again, this ambiguous story that offers no resolution, although there is this illusion of closure in the confession. And can one ever really be free from evil? And the suggestion is no, one cannot when one engages in evil. So I think those four Poe short stories, that wasn't easy to say, give you a little bit of a sense of the way that Poe goes about his writing. The second eyeless cat is very similar to the Madeline figure, the doppelganger that we've talked about as well. Burying things in the cellar, what could be like hiding the secrets that we try to bury in our own lives. The police represent the moral authority. So those are just some of the ways that the text can be viewed symbolically. So for our attendance question, as we move on beyond Poe and start thinking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is a novella, and that means it's longer than a short story, but it is not quite as long as a novel. And I was able to find a link online for that if you wanted to access that. But again, keep in mind that you can also find the text on reserves. But our attendance question was about these four short stories. And ultimately, which short story did you like the least and why? I might have asked you which you liked the best and why. Now I'd like to know which one you liked the least and why. So that'll be due Friday the 7th at 8 a.m. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Remember, there is no class on Monday, but I'll also post something on Moodle on Monday to remind you. Take care. Bye-bye.